Richard Dawkins said that, like genes, ideas, which he called memes, were self-propagating and expanding conceptual organisms, in that they propagate themselves and spread, and they only die out when they're not useful. Okay, so for instance, if you take David Cameron, you might say he is a transatlantic Churchillian in that he has some view of right-wing communitarianism, that he is a Eurosceptic, and that he is motivated by his own personal ambition, and also a pragmatic humanitarianism, as in Libya. Kyle Bass, you may not have heard of Kyle Bass, but he is an investor, or speculator rather, who has $1 trillion worth of speculative money behind him, and has been betting against the euro for many years. His idea of the euro collapsing has propagated itself without any actual economic foundation. If you take the fact that he is holding dollars, which has been devalued by the Federal Reserve, which created the inflationary crisis, which led to Freddie Mae and Fannie Mae at least, but not Lehman Brothers. I'll explain Lehman Brothers in a second. Collapsing when they could have basically just spent $1 billion. It turned it into $1 trillion crisis, and then as the inflationary pressures that they exported to Europe and the Far East as well, to China and Japan particularly, and Indonesia, created a $14.7 trillion debt crisis, which we're still feeling the effects of now, but it's been blamed by certain politicians like David Cameron on Greece, Italy and Spain and Portugal, which, if you look at the magnitude of money involved, possibly possibly be. Then you've got the meme of the New World Order, this idea of a criminal organisation which has tangential links to other power groups. That is based on Freemasonry for the most part, and some parts of it are Zionist Freemasonry, which is a slightly different ideology because it's based on ethnicity and the extermination of other people. Of course, there are people who are Jews of the Vienna School who are not Zionist at all, and they are humanitarians. They're not to be lumped in with the New World Order. But what is Freemasonry? Freemasonry is a basic belief that in neoclassical economics, ultra-conservatism, Marxism to some extent, and also Satanism, which is, they might all be considered contradictory ideas, but they do have a singular root, historical root. And what is the New World Order in terms of actual factual things? It is but Exxon and Haliburton. Now, they were responsible for Lehman Brothers, which really caused this crisis by threatening Hank Paulson. And Hank Paulson was the US Treasury Secretary. He cut off funding and forced the Federal Reserve to cut off funding to Lehman Brothers. So the Federal Reserve is a Zionist group, but it is not anything to do with the New World Order. It's slight. There are like icebergs moving in a flow. They are power groups that are just touching, tangential power groups, and there are also power groups in a kind of glacier structure, moving above each other or below each other, are not quite aware of each other's existence. As I've explained before, using the Roman model, there was the Caesars at the top, the crime families. That will be the New World Order, and the demos, which included the elected politicians who people think run things, and the central bankers, the intelligentsia, and then below them the citizens, and then below them people who are in debt poverty, i.e. slaves. and most people are in debt poverty. Which leads me back to Kyle Bass. Why has Kyle Bass got such an interest in the euro falling, and why has he pressured certain conservative groups such as David Cameron on his interview at Newsnight, which has an ultra conservative streak running through that program, to back out away from the euro? Well, the guy has $1 trillion of investors behind him, you know, so he's basically the mouthpiece. How much money he really has, it's really not so important. The fact is that he's betting everything on the dollar, even though the United States has a 300% debt to GDP ratio, right? Which is, if you take the euro as a whole, the euro is about a 65% debt ratio. If you take the worst offenders, Greece, Spain, and Italy and Portugal, they have around a debt ratio of 100 to 120%. Okay, which was before, which was around the same amount as the United States before the next current trend of stimulus money was and also extension of loans to the banks and everything else, which of course the Europeans bailed the Americans out to the tune of $14.7 trillion, and now the Americans are not willing to give us back our money, and that is the true point of the crisis. But Kyle Bass is like David Cameron and Kyle Bass might have nothing to do with the NWO, but they are. I've used them as examples of a transitional idea of the memes, the conceptual ideology that is moving more and more towards that. Because Kyle Bass believes he has a right as a speculator to parasite off of people, and how does he do that? Well, when a bank creates a mortgage, you do not know, and you have no control over it. That loan as a death contract, that's what a mortgage means, that the bank can trade that mortgage between 100 other banks, and a bank is anyone who lends short and invests long. You know, each time they're doing that, they're creating more credit through the fractional reserve banking system. And of course, a central bank can be blamed for having the fiat money system in the first place, but a gold standard would be even worse. The real point, as Steve Keen said, check him out, he's a good economist, is that the ratio between government money and credit money is changing, of course. There are three conceptions of money. Money is a unit of value. Currency, banknotes and coins, are a unit of exchange. It has no intrinsic value in itself. In fact, the most stable currency in the world was the tally stick method of the new privately created Bank of England before it was nationalised back in the 17th century, before it was nationalised in the 40s. And then they changed to the gold standard. Now, Kyle Bass is also talking about having the gold standard back as opposed to the euro. Well, that would allow him and his speculator friends to manipulate the gold price to cause crashes. And also, most of the gold is produced in South Africa and Russia, quite hostile nations to Europe and America. So his ideological bent on destroying the euro is what has caused these rumours of the euro demising. But as I'll explain in part 2, there are some problems with the euro. I'll admit that, So I'll see you in part 2 to explain the history of the euro.